Welcome back to the Bridgehead Briefing, everyone. We're going to be covering a couple of really important topics today. The first is horror stories coming out of Canada's euthanasia regime. I'm sick of covering these stories, and you may be sick of hearing them, but I think it's really important for us to understand what is actually happening, especially because this is being debated in the US and in the UK. Our second story is more of a good news story. Canada's politicians are finally standing up and pushing back against the transgender movement. This has been happening for just over a year now, and it's really encouraging to finally see this self-imposed artificial consensus get broken wide open. The third story is a very dark and grim story. The Satanic Temple of America has now opened 2 abortion clinics and are claiming that abortion is their sacred religious sacrament and are saying that abortion is thus protected by America's religious liberty laws. Canada's euthanasia activists and suicide activists always promised the public that the path to medical aid in dying, as they now call it, would be a narrow path with high guardrails. And as we've covered before on this podcast and cover regularly at thebridgehead.ca, they were lying. It's a 4-lane highway, and there's nobody patrolling it. And not a week goes by without some grim new development, and the Trudeau government refuses to listen to those who have been now hoarsely sounding the alarm. It does get tiresome to cover these horror stories, but one of the reasons it's so essential to cover these stories as they come out is because of what these stories tell us about Canada's euthanasia regime. And the bill just proposed in the United Kingdom to legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia there essentially proposes the Canadian system. And so a glimpse into Canada's present is also a look into the UK's future if they choose to take this path. And the same goes for those American states that are also considering euthanasia. Thankfully, a glimmer of good news is that the governor of Delaware recently vetoed their assisted suicide bill. So I want to start with a report by the Associated Press that was published on October 16. And in the story, they cover the questions euthanasia providers in Canada are struggling with and discussing on their private forums. One of these stories featured a homeless man being killed by lethal injection. So let me quote directly from the AP here. One doctor wrote that although his patient had a serious lung disease, his suffering was mostly because he is homeless, in debt, and cannot tolerate the idea of long-term care of any kind. A respondent questioned whether the fear of living in the nursing home was truly intolerable, as it must be to qualify under Canada's system. Another said the prospect of looking at the wall or ceiling waiting to be fed to have diapers changed was sufficiently painful to qualify. The man was eventually euthanized. One provider said that any suggestion they should provide patients with better housing options before offering euthanasia seems unrealistic and hence cruel amid a national housing crisis. So in other words, this is a frank admission that because of Canada's current standard of living, what we're seeing is impoverished people who feel they have no choice but to die at the end of the needle simply because they cannot get the housing they need, cannot get the disability care they need, cannot get the long-term care that they need. Another one of the stories reported by the AP featured providers debating whether or not obesity made somebody eligible for assisted suicide. Listen to this. One woman with severe obesity described herself as a, quote, useless body taking up space. She'd lost interest in activities, became socially withdrawn, and said she had, quote, no purpose, according to the doctor who reviewed her case. Another physician, however, reasoned that the euthanasia was warranted because obesity is, quote, a medical condition which is indeed grievous and irremediable. And so because the reasonably foreseeable death standard has been removed from Canada's euthanasia law, and doctors are no longer required to only dispense lethal injections to those who actually have a prognosis, a terminal prognosis, virtually anything qualifies at this point because depression is grievous and sometimes irremediable insofar as that it's a long-term condition. And now what we're seeing is that this slippery slope is slick with blood, and the euthanasia providers are willing, in many cases, to euthanize almost anybody who asks. I think probably the most chilling story of all is the case of a woman who was very obviously pushed into accepting euthanasia. Let me read this from the AP here. When a health provider inquired whether anyone had euthanized patients for blindness, one provider reported 4 such cases. In one, they said an elderly man who saw only shadows was his wife's caregiver when he requested euthanasia, but he wanted her to die with him. Listen to this part very carefully. The couple had several appointments with an assessor before the wife, quote, finally agreed to be killed, the provider said. Not my words, that's the Associated Press. She died unexpectedly just days before the scheduled euthanasia. But listen to that again. Before 4 meetings, and then she finally agreed to be killed. This is somebody who essentially broke down and finally assented to being euthanized. This is somebody who was pushed into euthanasia. And other providers also cited examples of people being euthanized for grief, which again can also be a grievous and irremediable condition. It should be obvious to anybody watching what is going on in Canada that there are no brakes on this train. And it keeps on getting worse. I'm just going to cite a few stories that have come out this month in October. Linda Madiford, the newly elected president of the Regina Catholic Women's League, will be sharing her family's experience coming up here at the Catholic Health Association of Saskatchewan's convention. And she tells the story about how her mother passed away, and then her family moved their father into a care facility in Saskatoon. And here's what she said. The very day after, we got a blanket email inviting us to come to a presentation in the dining room. And what was the topic? Accessing euthanasia. Manafort said she was deeply disturbed that the people they had just entrusted their father to, the caretakers they were trusting with their father's life and well-being, they'd been there for a day, and they got an email suggesting that they attend a presentation where access to euthanasia would be laid out. And Manafort added that, quote, there is a push from the top down, that if you aren't open to the idea, that is euthanasia, you should be. I worry for the people who feel the pressure of, well, my doctor advised it, or someone with a clipboard kept on coming around and asking, end quote. And we know many stories like that. We've covered them at the Bridgehead. We've covered them on this podcast. There are people who are consistently over and over and over again offered euthanasia by medical professionals who are essentially telling them, your life is not worth living. We have the solution for you. All you've got to do is assent. Another story, and this one is just chilling, and just consider, put yourself or one of your loved ones in this position for a second. This was covered this month, again, by The Telegraph, a UK paper, so the UK politicians who have to vote on assisted suicide know that these stories are happening. Relay the experience of a Canadian woman who was about to undergo life-saving cancer surgery. She was getting a mastectomy. She was offered assisted suicide by doctors as she was about to enter the operating room for her mastectomy. As she was about to enter the operating room. Consider that. Unbelievable. The people at their most vulnerable, feeling like a burden. People who are recognized they need a lot of care. People who need other people to help keep them alive, to care for them. These are the people at those moments in their life that are most difficult, where they are the most vulnerable, where they are the most dependent. Then they're being offered by their very caretakers, by medical professionals, the opportunity to receive euthanasia. And as I quoted from the Associated Press there, people are being euthanized for being poor, they're being euthanized for being blind, they're being euthanized for grief, they're being euthanized for disability. But none of these stories seem to give euthanasia activists any pause. Instead, they're constantly pushing for more. On October 16, the Financial Post published an editorial by Andrew Roman titled this, quote, you should be able to reserve MAiD service. Quebec is going to let people pre-order medical assistance in dying. Ottawa shouldn't try. Stop it. People have that right. Anyone still arguing about rights as Canadian physicians euthanize the most vulnerable should not be taken seriously. But here's Roman arguing in the opening paragraph of his piece that if we don't permit this, that is allowing people ahead of time to say that they want MAiD if this happens to them, all kinds of elderly people with dementia will not be killed, which Roman clearly thinks is a tragedy. Let me quote from him directly here. As Canada's population continues to age, demand for MAiD, medical aid in dying, will only increase. But with rates of dementia also increasing, the cognitive ability of patients to consent becomes a barrier. The prevalence of dementia more than doubles every 5 years among seniors, rising from less than 1% in those aged 65 to 69 to about 25% among people 85 and older. In other words, what Roman's saying here is if we don't pass this policy, if we don't allow people to sign advance directives, then there's a ton of people with dementia that won't die by lethal injection. And let me tell you a story for a moment. These sorts of things are now happening in other countries. In the Netherlands, there was a woman who had apparently allegedly expressed a desire for euthanasia, although she had changed her mind and gone back and forth several times, was being cared for in a nursing home and had dementia. The caretaker said she was a very happy woman. She played games with other residents of the nursing home. She was not suffering. But the family argued that she would not have wanted to live this way and that because she had dementia, she should be euthanized. But it didn't go really well because the woman didn't want to be euthanized. And so first they laced her coffee with a sedative, but when she was first knocked cold, she woke up as they were about to lethally inject her. And so the family held her down while the doctor injected her with poison and killed her. They held this old woman down and then lethally injected her, killing her. This case actually went before the Dutch courts. The Dutch justice system concluded that the doctor and the family had done nothing wrong. This is the kind of thing, by the way, that will happen if Andrew Roman and people like him get their way. Let me quote another paragraph here, revealing the sort of breathtaking ignorance of how Canada's euthanasia regime has unfolded. Roman wrote this, quote, "There is no good reason why, with the numerous safeguards in Ottawa's and Quebec's laws, patients should be precluded from making advance request before their condition renders them incapable of giving consent, and no good reason why their physicians should become criminals for honoring their patients' duly stipulated advance request." No good reason why? Safeguards? What a joke. And this is published in one of our major newspapers. It's like he hasn't read any of the stories that have come out on this stuff. He concludes, MAiD is also regulated under provincial law and by the same medical colleagues that regulate abortion. Colleges, pardon me, not colleagues, that regulate abortion. Ottawa should amend the criminal code to exempt MAiD altogether and, as is in the case with abortion, let the medical profession do its work in accordance with provincial regulation and patients' wishes, end quote. So there you have it. That is, it's honest, I'll give it that. The final goal of euthanasia activists is euthanasia on demand, doctor's license to kill. And the thing is, we do not have to ask ourselves what will happen if people like Andrew Roman and the folks at Dying with Dignity get their way, because it's happening already. It's happening already. We have no excuse. We're walking into this with our eyes wide open. And so are the legislatures in the UK who are considering this. So are the lawmakers in the US who are considering this. We know what will happen. We know what this will do to the vulnerable. And if we make this choice, we are deciding to put vulnerable, disabled, elderly, sick people in this position. And that's just the truth. So the second story I want to cover today is a bit more of a good news story. Canadian Conservatives are finally standing up against the transgender movement, and they're winning. After a decade, transgender activists are getting pushback from Canadian Conservative politicians. Now, a lot of Canadians don't even recognize their country anymore because for years, no Conservative politician in Canada would touch the transgender issue with a 10-foot pole because they're essentially gun-shy of any issue considered to be socially conservative. And legislators thus allowed progressive politicians and activists to implement gender ideology entirely unimpeded, from Trudeau's conversion therapy ban, which actually criminalizes some conversations between therapists or pastors and their congregants, to the public school system, which actively hides information about children transitioning from parents. In basically less than a decade, the transgender agenda was enshrined into law and policy in virtually every Canadian institution at every level. And that all started to change in June 2023, when a politician many Canadians had never heard about, New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs, finally decided he'd had enough. And Higgs essentially decided, looking at the school system, that this was an intolerable situation. He didn't do a lot of background research into how it would play. As a former teacher and as a dad, he just decided this would be the right thing to do. He announced that going forward, children under 16 seeking to change their gender at school by changing their names or their pronouns would need parental permission. I want to point out this is like a pretty anemic parental rights policy. It's just you need to tell the parents that this is going on. And again, most Canadians were unaware that this was even happening. The National Post is the only newspaper that reports on this issue at all. And even then, it's been pretty recent since they started doing deep dives on this. And then the predictable happened. LGBT activists went hard after Blaine Higgs, and he refused to back down. In fact, he said he was willing to fight an election over the issue. And then polling came out and proved his position was actually wildly popular. And it's interesting to see the domino effect that Higgs has had here, because he proved that the water was just fine, and all kinds of other premiers started to take notice. So on August 22, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe announced a nearly identical policy, and he doubled down even harder because polls indicated that 86% of Saskatchewaners approved. And so what LGBT activists did is they deferred to the courts, because the courts are incredibly progressive, and they figured that whenever the legislators do something that they disagree with, they can just default to the courts and appeal to human rights. And so the Saskatchewan Court of King's Bench granted an injunction against the policy, and in an unprecedented move, Scott Moe actually recalled the legislator and then used the notwithstanding clause, which is from Section 33 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It allows legislators to override the courts in rare circumstances, and he overrode the injunction to put it into effect anyways. Again, this is unprecedented. This is a conservative politician actually using a rarely used tool in their constitutional toolbox to say, this issue is so important, we cannot allow the courts to interfere with the will of the people. Following that, then Manitoba Premier Heather Stefanson promised similar policies. She lost an election before she could do so, but an Angus Reid poll showed 76% of support for Manitobans for parental notification. Notice all of these polls are well over 60% of the population, so a supermajority of Canadians support these policies. Next was Ontario Education Minister Stephen Lecce. He held a press conference to announce that the Ford government also supported parental notification. It's really frustrating that the Ford government hasn't actually taken those words and turned them into policy, because we know that this is still going on in Ontario schools. But so they may be empty words, but it means they recognize there's a trend shifting here. And it's good to get ourselves on the record supporting parental notification. And then Alberta Premier Danielle Smith blew the issue wide open. She proposed legislation that prohibits all gender reassignment surgeries, that is, sex change surgeries on youth under 18, a ban on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors under the age of 16, and restricting female sports to females, and mandating a parental opt-in for each instance a teacher wishes to discuss gender identity or sexuality, and requiring parental notification for changing a student's given name or pronoun. So Danielle Smith went farther than all of these other premiers in saying, this is a medical travesty. Children are being incredibly damaged, and we actually need to put a stop to this. Children cannot undergo these surgeries or take these treatments. And then, as I mentioned in a previous video, federal Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre followed suit. He was ducking questions on this at first. On September 2022 of 2023, he announced his support for parental rights and said that Justin Trudeau needed to leave the kids alone, which is the slogan of the parental rights movement. And since then has defended his position of reserving female spaces for females only in the press. Now Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe concurs, and he's going even farther. This month, he announced plans to actually restrict boys' bathrooms and changing rooms to boys and girls' changing rooms and bathrooms to girls, after it came out that boys, biological boys, were changing alongside girls in a changing room at the Balgony Elementary School, which is a rural school in Saskatchewan. And since I worked on the story, another update on that story has come out. It turns out that the two boys who were changing alongside girls before gym class, this controversy started when a grade 7 student voiced her discomfort to her parents. And as it turns out, these two children are the children of Jared Clark, a Saskatchewan NDP MLA. What are the chances that one dad has two transgender kids? I think of a funny quote that I saw on X. Well, I guess it was kind of grim in some ways. He said, a transgender child is like a vegan cat. We all know who's making the decisions there. But anyways, now Scott Moe has promised to change the policy. And he announced, if we are reelected, I'd be very clear. There will be a directive that would come from the Minister of Education that would say that biological boys would not be in the change room with biological girls. And he called this a first order of business, his words priority. And when he was asked about the rights of trans-identified students, he said, quote, what about the rights of all the other girls that are changing in that very change room? They have rights as well. Now, these developments are very significant because in just over a year, basically from Blaine Higgs' move till now, gender ideology has gone from an untouchable agenda to one that conservative politicians are actively eager to run against right across the country. So Danielle Smith, for example, she's portrayed in the media as some foaming at the mouth right-winger, but the reality is she's not religious as far as I know. She is not socially conservative, and in fact, in her previous political career as leader of the Wild Rose Party, she left that party complaining about the social conservative influence in that party. So she doesn't see this issue as a social conservative issue. She sees this as a matter of merely protecting kids. And so now we've got this moderate libertarian premier willing to go all in despite knowing full well that she will face the full wrath of the LGBT movement. Pierre Poilievre is no social conservative either, and yet he's willing to stake out positions that would have been unthinkable just 2 years ago. Why? Why are not socially conservative politicians willing to take on the transgender movement? Because they know they can win. It's almost more encouraging to me when I see politicians who are not socially conservative, who are not religious, tackle this issue head on, because it tells us two things. One, they know that they can win on this issue. And two, it tells us that the LGBT movement's hold on the Canadian consensus, which was always a manufactured one, is breaking. I've been saying for years that Canadians have far more common sense than their leaders. The trans agenda was imposed on us top down by an airtight faction of progressive politicians, activists, and academics, and sort of protected by a phalanx of government-funded media and the state broadcaster, the CBC. And it only took one premier deciding he'd had enough to break this whole thing wide open. And when he did, it turns out that Canadians by wide margins were huge fans of parental rights and common sense policies. It turns out that Trudeau and trans activists do not speak for Canadians as they so often claim. And this is a lesson. This is a lesson that conservative politicians need to learn, because the problem with conservative politicians in Canada is very often they do not have any desire to lead. They want to essentially be progressives, but with a smarter accountant. They don't want to touch any of these issues, and so these issues are dominated entirely by radical ideologues. And it took Blaine Higgs to show us that much more was possible. I hope they learned their lesson, and I hope that what we're seeing here is a turning of the tide on a very, very important issue. Our final story today is about the Satanic Temple of America. Now, many of you may not have heard of them. That's a very good thing. They were the feature of a major award-winning documentary called Hail Satan a few years back. And what that documentary revealed, and what their actions since have revealed, is that they are essentially abortion activists, and they've been campaigning hard for abortion for years. They are, believe it or not, the Satanists are a tax-exempt religious organization. They're based in Salem, Massachusetts, which they chose because of the infamous witch hunts a couple of centuries ago. And they claim not to believe in a literal Satan, and they certainly don't believe in God, but they do describe abortion as a religious ritual and a, quote, sacramental act that confirms the rights of bodily autonomy. In other words, the Satanists basically worship themselves, and Satan, no doubt, very much approves. In fact, the Satanic Temple has been seeking to weaponize religious liberty laws to have abortion declared a sacrament. And Lucien Greaves, the creepy founder of the temple, has raffled a free abortion. And in 2021, he spearheaded an Abortion Saves Lives billboard campaign in Texas. I've written about this before, and Lucien Greaves, the satanic founder, actually started taking shots at me on Twitter, which did make me feel very fulfilled. The Satanic Temple is now taking matters into its own hands. They've launched what they call Samuel Alito's Mom's Satanic Abortion Clinic, which they named after the pro-life Supreme Court justice appointed by George Bush, who authored the Dobbs decision which overturned Roe v. Wade. And they described this as, quote, an online clinic that provides religious medication abortion care. The clinic provides abortion medication via mail to those in New Mexico who wish to perform the Satanic Temple's religious abortion ritual, which is brutally killing your baby in the womb. The website for this so-called clinic includes a really cruel cartoon of a woman who's identified as Samuel Alito's mom. And in the cartoon, she's saying, if only abortion was legal when I was pregnant. In other words, we wish that Samuel Alito had been killed in the womb. And the site also assures visitors that, quote, patients pay a pharmacy for the medication, but the medical and religious services are free. And Lucien Greaves celebrated this on X, saying, quote, happy second satanic abortion clinic opening day, because that's where we are in 2024. They've now opened a second clinic, this one in Virginia, which is, of course, predictably billed as the world's second satanic abortion clinic. And I want to read, I'm not going to direct anybody to their site, but I'll read what they wrote here. Today marks the opening of the Satanic Temple Health's second telehealth abortion clinic in Virginia, serving the state and surrounding region. Just like our New Mexico clinic, our services will be free of charge, with patients only needing to cover the cost of medication through a third party at a low price. We have been fighting back against the efforts to restrict abortion access in the following years after the catastrophic Dobbs decision. While many clinics have been forced to shut down, we took a bold step forward by opening the world's first religious abortion clinic on February 14, 2023. And since then, we have proudly offered over 100 abortions in New Mexico at no cost to patients, with an average cost of $91 per procedure. We provide the lowest cost option for pregnancy terminations in the state. No doubt the Satanists are Democratic voters. The Satanists also go to great length to emphasize that abortion is their sacrament. They say on their site, the Satanic Temple is the leading beacon of light in the battle for abortion access. With Roe v. Wade overturned, a religious exemption will be the only available challenge to many restrictions to access. The Satanic Temple stands alone because we are the only entity that can assert a religious liberty claim that terminating a pregnancy is a central part of a religious ritual that encourages self-empowerment and affirms bodily autonomy. And so they said this means that the imposition of waiting periods and mandatory counseling is akin to demanding a waiting period in counseling before one can be baptized or receive communion. So in their mind, the physical destruction of a human being developing in the womb is similar to baptism or communion. It's no surprise to those of us who work in the pro-life movement that the primary preoccupation of Satanists is abortion. I've seen people outside abortion clinics walking into abortion clinics yell, "Hail Satan." And I really think that anybody who has spent any amount of time standing in front of abortion clinics really does feel a really dark and oppressive energy at these places of death, these fields of blood. It's hard to describe. I know many other Christians who are outside abortion clinics every single day will say they very much feel that abortion clinics are often very demonic areas. I don't know if Lucien Greaves of the Satanic Temple believes in actual demons, but I can assure him that the demons very much do believe in him. And in many ways, one of the reasons this is so sort of horrifying in a very chilling way is that abortion is the demonic inversion of the gospel message. The gospel message is my body broken for you. And of course, the message of abortion is I'll break your body for me. It's the precise inversion of the gospel message. Satan can't invent anything. He can't create anything. He can only twist things. And so abortion is really the perfect satanic sacrament. The brutal killing of a child created in God's image, the hardening of the consciences of all those involved in the procedure. Every day, God brings into being little children who are created in his image, who have never existed before and will never exist again. And every day at abortion clinics across Canada, the United States, the West, we carve return to sender into their corpses and we pitch them back into eternity. Abortion is the most important issue that faces anyone. It's why, despite the unpopularity of some of my opinions, even politically, there's nothing more important than this. The Satanists realize this, and voters need to realize this as well. Finally, after that grim story, we'll leave you with something a little bit more lighthearted. Last week, Donald Trump spoke at the Al Smith Dinner, which is a big Catholic charity dinner hosted every year in New York City. It used to be politicians kind of ribbing each other back and forth with good-natured and self-deprecating jokes. Of course, in the age of Trump, things have gotten a lot more hostile. Kamala Harris didn't show up this year, and Trump did. And he gave a brutal, savage monologue in which he told a lot of jokes. Most of them, I find them funny, but I also find them cruel. And so I think that Trump encourages a lot of instincts we have that we should be suppressing rather than encouraging. I'll admit I find them funny. I'll also admit that the kinds of humor he uses is often really ad hominem and really degrading in a lot of ways. But he made a couple of jokes that I think really nailed it. One of them was a joke that he made at the expense of one of the top Democrats, Chuck Schumer. And I'm going to play that joke for you now.
Chuck Schumer is here looking very glum. Doesn't he look glum? He looks glum. But look on the bright side, Chuck, considering how woke your party has become. If Kamala loses, you still have a chance to become the first woman president. And I actually said, do you mind if I do that? He said, no, you got to do what you got to do. He's a pro. He's a professional.
There's two things I want to say about that joke. One, the reason it's so funny is because the Democratic commitment to gender ideology means that they quite literally do believe that a man can become a woman simply because he says so. And so it's not outside the realm of possibility based on the ideological guidelines laid out by the transgender movement that Chuck Schumer couldn't just identify as a woman tomorrow and they would have to take him at his word. Watch Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman?, if you doubt that this is the mainstream view of gender ideology. The second thing I want to point out, though, is the little aside at the end of the joke that most people missed, where Trump says, I actually asked Chuck Schumer if I could tell that joke. I just wanted to check clear with him first, and he said, no, you got to tell it. And that's interesting. I would not have guessed that Chuck Schumer, a top Democrat, was okay with Donald Trump mocking gender ideology, mocking self-identification, transgender identity. Maybe Chuck Schumer, like so many older liberals, thinks it's actually all garbage, thinks it's very mockable, but just doesn't dare say so himself because his party is in thrall to these people and he can't say that publicly. But he can sign off on Trump doing so. Interesting thought. Either way, thank you so much for joining the Bridgehead Briefing this week. We hope you found it helpful, as always. If you enjoyed it, please do like the video, share it around, subscribe, tell your friends to subscribe, leave a comment. You can heckle or harass me in the comments, and I'll probably respond to all of them. And if you have some ideas of subjects you really think that we should be covering, you can drop those too. Otherwise, you can find us wherever you get your podcast content. Thanks so much for listening.